The art of psychological warfare. Most wars don't begin with weapons. They begin with perception. Before a single bullet is fired, before a single threat is spoken, the battle is already happening inside the human mind. Fear, uncertainty, misdirection, emotional pressure. The people who understand psychological warfare know something dangerous. If you can control what someone thinks, you can often control what they do. And history is filled with men who mastered this. Military strategists, intelligence agencies, political leaders, corporate giants, all using the same invisible principles to dominate opponents without direct confrontation, because the strongest person in the room is rarely the loudest. It's usually the one controlling the emotional temperature without anyone noticing. And if conversations like this make you see the world differently, stay close to this channel. Most people never learn how influence actually works. In 1274, a small group of samurai stood on the shores of Japan, waiting for an invasion they knew they couldn't stop. Across the sea, the Mongol Empire was coming. At that point in history, the Mongols were almost unstoppable. They had conquered massive parts of Asia and Europe through brutality, speed, and psychological terror. Entire cities surrendered before battles even began because the Mongols understood something most armies didn't. Fear spreads faster than soldiers. Before invading a region, they often allowed survivors to escape conquered cities intentionally. Those survivors carried stories, horrifying stories, about massacres, destruction, and impossible military strength. By the time the Mongol army actually arrived somewhere, half the battle was already won psychologically. That's the first rule of psychological warfare: control the mind, and the body usually follows. And centuries later, the exact same principle still controls the modern world. Only now, the battlefield looks different. Today, psychological warfare happens in boardrooms, media, politics, relationships, social media, and everyday conversations. People manipulate perception, emotion, and uncertainty constantly, often without realizing they're doing it. Because psychological warfare is not always about destruction. Sometimes it's about influence. Sun Tzu wrote about this in The Art of War, more than 2,500 years ago. He believed the greatest victory was defeating an enemy without fighting at all. Think about how terrifying that idea actually is, winning before the battle even begins. Modern intelligence agencies operate on similar principles. During the Cold War, governments invested billions into propaganda, misinformation campaigns, and psychological operations designed to influence entire populations without firing weapons directly. Cold War. Why? Because controlling perception is often more effective than controlling reality. If people believe something strongly enough, they behave as if it's true. And human beings are shockingly easy to influence emotionally. Fear changes decision-making. Uncertainty creates dependency. Scarcity increases perceived value. Isolation weakens resistance. The human brain has predictable psychological patterns, and powerful institutions study those patterns obsessively. Look at social media algorithms. Why do outrage-driven posts spread faster than calm, rational discussions? Because emotionally charged content bypasses logic. Anger, fear, and controversy keep people engaged longer. Platforms understand this perfectly because attention is profitable. That's psychological warfare at scale, and most people participate in it without ever noticing. But the darkest part of psychological warfare isn't manipulation itself. It's subtle manipulation, the kind that feels invisible. A skilled manipulator rarely forces you to do something directly. Instead, they guide your emotions until you believe the decision was yours all along. That's why experienced interrogators don't always rely on aggression. Sometimes they use silence, exhaustion, emotional mirroring, controlled friendliness. They slowly lower resistance until the target starts revealing information voluntarily, not through force. Through psychology, even in personal relationships, these dynamics appear constantly. Some individuals create emotional dependency by alternating attention and distance. Others use guilt to maintain control. Some dominate conversations by making people constantly seek approval or validation. And the frightening part? Most victims never recognize the pattern while it's happening. Because psychological warfare works best when the target believes everything is normal. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this centuries ago while studying political power in Renaissance Italy. Niccolò Machiavelli, he observed rulers carefully and realized perception often mattered more than morality. A leader didn't always need to be loved. He needed to appear powerful, certain, untouchable, because uncertainty weakens authority. That's why powerful figures throughout history carefully controlled public image. Roman emperors built massive monuments not only for beauty, but for psychological impact. Corporations build towering headquarters for the same reason today. Size influences perception, presence influences emotion, symbols influence behavior. And once you understand that, you begin noticing psychological warfare everywhere, not just in history, in everyday life, in conversations, in media, in politics, even in the way people present themselves online. Because beneath modern society's polished surface Human psychology has barely changed at all. The most dangerous thing about psychological warfare is that it doesn't always look hostile. Sometimes it looks intelligent, charismatic, confident, even trustworthy. That's why some of the most influential people in history were never physically intimidating at all. They simply understood human behavior better than everyone around them. Take Edward Bernays, for example. Most people have never heard his name, but his ideas quietly shaped modern advertising, politics, and public influence. Bernays understood that human beings are deeply emotional creatures pretending to be rational. Instead of trying to change people's logic directly, he focused on controlling symbols, desires, fears, and social perception. And it worked. Entire industries adopted psychological influence techniques based on those principles. Not because people are stupid, because the human mind naturally seeks emotional shortcuts. We trust confidence, we follow certainty, we fear exclusion, we crave status. And once someone understands those psychological triggers, influence becomes significantly easier. That's why psychological warfare is often less about attacking people and more about studying them. The strongest manipulators are usually the best observers. They notice emotional reactions, past insecurities, weaknesses, because every emotional weakness becomes a potential entry point. A person desperate for approval becomes easier to control through validation. A person terrified of rejection becomes vulnerable to emotional withdrawal. Someone addicted to status can be manipulated through comparison and envy, and this doesn't only happen between individuals. Entire systems operate this way. Political campaigns understand fear-based messaging increases emotional engagement. Luxury brands understand exclusivity creates psychological desire. Social media platforms understand controversy keeps users emotionally invested longer. The game is always psychological, always, but here's where this conversation becomes important. Learning psychological warfare should not turn you into a manipulator. It should make you aware enough to stop becoming an easy target, because awareness changes everything. Once you understand emotional manipulation, you start noticing how often people try to provoke reactions from you. Some want your anger because anger makes you predictable. Others want your attention because attention gives them significance. Some attempt to control you through guilt, pressure, fear, or emotional confusion. And most people spend their entire lives reacting automatically without ever stopping to ask, why am I feeling this right now? That question alone changes power dynamics instantly, because the moment you observe your emotions instead of obeying them, you regain control. That's why emotionally disciplined people feel different in conversations. Calmer, harder to manipulate, harder to pressure. They don't react immediately because they understand reaction gives away information. Silence forces the other person to reveal more. Patience creates leverage. Emotional control creates presence, and presence is power. Real psychological strength is not dominating others. It's mastering yourself so completely that external chaos stops controlling your internal state. That's rare. Especially today, modern society rewards impulsive reactions constantly. Algorithms reward outrage. News cycles reward fear. Social platforms reward emotional exposure. Everyone is encouraged to react instantly. And because of that, calmness has become intimidating. The person who remains composed during pressure automatically appears more powerful than the person losing emotional control. That's why the strongest individuals in any room are often the quietest observers. Not because they have nothing to say, because they understand the value of restraint. And maybe that's the final lesson behind psychological warfare. The greatest advantage is not learning how to manipulate people, it's learning how to remain unshaken when others try to manipulate you. Because once someone controls your emotions, they influence your decisions. Once they influence your decisions, they influence your life. And the majority of people never realize how much of their behavior is driven by invisible psychological pressure every single day. But now you'll start seeing it in conversations, in advertising, in politics, in relationships, everywhere. Not to become paranoid, but aware. Because awareness is protection. And in a world built on influence, awareness might be one of the rarest forms of power left. And if these kinds of conversations make you think differently about human behavior, you already know where to find this channel again. There's a lot more beneath the surface that most people never notice. Until next time, stay observant, stay controlled, and take care of your mind.